I'm so delighted to be at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Every year, it seems like it gets better. The leadership of the Aspen Institute has done a wonderful job helping all of really the country and the world to understand the power of ideas. You know, when we're in a world that's buffeted by the constant weather of politics, it's very important to remember that more important than the weather of politics is the climate of ideas. I learned once from a physicist that the biggest mistake you can make as a PhD physicist is mistaking the climate for the weather. The Aspen Ideas Festival doesn't do that. Congratulations on participating in it, and thank you for being here at this session, which I've been so excited about because I get to talk to my friend Simon Sinek. If you're here, it's because you know who Simon Sinek is. He's a best-selling author. He is a consultant to some of the most important organizations in the world, and he's an all-around purveyor of the ideas that can lift people up. He's a humanist. He was born in the UK, and he's lived in South Africa and Hong Kong, and most exotically in New Jersey. He attended Brandeis University and the City University of London. He got his start in the world of marketing and advertising. He had his own firm, Sinek Partners, and his understanding of leadership comes from his own mixed experiences leading that firm. That's not how you know him, however. Many of you became familiar with Simon Sinek all suddenly in 2009, where he had his breakout moment. Now, actually, nobody has a breakout moment. When you look at a rock band that suddenly breaks out on the scene, it turns out that they've been touring for 16 years before that. But everybody learned about them because they became very viral for whatever reasons. That happened to Simon in 2009 when he had a TED Talk, How Great Leaders Inspire Action, which is the third most watched TED Talk of all time, with 32 million views. And it was aligned with his first best-selling book, Start With Why. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Since then, he's had more bestsellers, of course. Leaders Eat Last, Why Some Teams Pull Together and Others Don't, which I recommend very highly to you for your interest. You won't be disappointed. And in 2016, Together is Better, a little book of inspiration. His next book, which is coming out in September, is Find Your Why, which talks about start with why, but how to do it, which is really important. And we're going to talk a little bit later about a very exciting new project that he's working on. It's in beta form, and I can't wait to learn more about it, and I can't wait for you to learn more about it too. We're going to take a few minutes and have a conversation. I'm going to ask him some questions. We're going to discuss issues around leadership that the country needs, that the world needs, that business needs, that families need, that we all need. And then you get to interview him after that in the back half of this hour. So welcome, Simon Sinek.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks. When Aspen invited me to come and do this, they said, who would you like to interview you? And they gave me sort of a list of all these famous journalists and things. And I said, no, I want Arthur Brooks, because he's the best. And I get to hang out here with my friend.
That's great. Thank you, really, Simon. The last time we were together was under really funny circumstances when many of you saw in the news right after the election in January, the Republicans, all the House Republicans and Senate Republicans went on retreat to Philadelphia, and this closed retreat. And I looked at the keynote speakers on this retreat, and it was Donald Trump and Vice President Pence and Simon Sinek and me, which was really, really great. But we got a little bit of time to hang out together and maybe cook up some things that we want to talk about today. And here's my first question. We have a crisis in leadership in this country, and people in this audience who are really politically mixed and ideologically mixed have different ways of describing that crisis, but there's nobody in here who thinks that leadership is the best it's been for our country politically or in business today. Describe the leadership crisis, how we got here, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit about where we can go.
Sure. The leadership crisis has nothing to do with the presidency. I think we've had a leadership crisis for quite some time, and it's been steadily getting worse over the past 20 or 30 years. And it's primarily due to the fact that we misunderstand what leadership is, and the strategies and the ways we're building our organizations are based on the false definition of leadership. Let me give you an example. So in business, for example, too many of our standard business philosophies today, the way we normally run businesses, are leftovers from philosophies and ideas that were introduced in the 80s and 90s. So for example, the concept of shareholder supremacy was a theory proposed in the late 1970s, popularized in the 80s and 90s, and is now the standard way of doing business. Remember, the 80s and 90s were boom years, relative peace in the world, a kinder and gentler Cold War, and so a lot of the ideas that we were generating on how to lead and how to build our businesses were based on those conditions. In other words, when boom years are there, we sort of become a little more selfish, right? So shareholder supremacy was a theory proposed back then, popularized in the 80s and 90s. Now it's standard way of doing business and arguably hasn't been a successful experiment. Every CEO of every public company, it's a big open secret, hates the analyst community, hates Wall Street, yet they play the game. The concept of using mass layoffs to balance the books, which is now standard practice in so many large businesses, public and private, that we don't even recognize how destructive it is to the human spirit and to the culture of an organization, did not exist in the United States prior to the 1980s. Did not exist. But it was popularized in the 80s and 90s and now has become normal. And so you see a lot of those sort of me first and putting the organization before the people, or numbers before people, really in government policy and in business that are now standard today. These are very, very different times, and I think that leadership hasn't kept up with the times. The organizations that understand prioritizing human beings, the life of a human being over the abstraction of a number, are the ones that outperform, out-innovate, by the way, have no millennial problems than the other companies.
Can you give me a couple of examples of the more enlightened view that we actually see in business today?
Yeah, there's a few. A smaller number in public companies, but Bob Chapman, who's sitting right here, he's talking tomorrow, right? He's talking tomorrow. Bob Chapman runs a company called Barry Waymiller. It's about a $2 or $3 billion business, about 8,000 employees. Good old-fashioned American manufacturing. So when Kimberly-Clark needs a machine to make toilet paper, Barry Waymiller makes that machine. And if you ask Bob, what does the company do, he won't tell you we're in manufacturing. He'll tell you that we're building extraordinary people to do extraordinary things. And if you ask Bob, how does he know he's successful, he'll say, we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people. And he firmly believes these things. And I've written about Bob in Leaders Eat Last. It's how I came to know him, about somebody who truly understands that business is a people thing. And I'll give you one example of how he's different. So in 2008, during the recession, Barry Waymiller was hit very, very hard by the recession. Of course, in recessionary times, large capital expenditures get cut first, and so that affects buying new machinery. And they lost 30% of their pipeline like that. So like so many companies, they couldn't afford their labor pool, and like so many companies, the board got together and said to Bob, you need to have layoffs. You need to save $10 million. And Bob absolutely refused. And instead what they did is they implemented a furlough program where every employee had to take 4 weeks of unpaid vacation. They didn't have to take it consecutively, and they could take it whenever they wanted. Everybody from secretary to CEO. And when Bob announced the program to the company, he said, it's better we should all suffer a little than any of us should have to suffer a lot. And morale went up. And what happens in well-led organizations is when leadership demonstrates a care for us as human beings, the biological reaction to those conditions is we actually start caring for each other much more. So in most organizations, when leadership cares more about numbers than us and will sacrifice our lives to meet some arbitrary projection, we hunker down and we become paranoid and self-interested and mistrustful, right? Well, something happened at Barry Waymiller that nobody expected, and it wasn't part of the program, which is people who could afford it more started trading with those who could afford it less. So some would take 5 weeks so that others only had to take 3. In other words, the people started taking care of each other. The recession, they got out of the recessionary times, the furlough program was done away with, they restored the 401k program they had frozen, they actually back paid on 401k from where they had frozen it, good luck hiring any of those employees even if you offer them more money. They will not leave. And the productivity, innovation, and intensity of this organization is absolutely unbelievable. And he completely went against what is considered standard on how we treat how we fix problems.
That's fantastic. You know, I have a strange case study that I found accidentally of that principle. For those of you who don't know, I'm the president of a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the American Enterprise Institute, and I took over on January 1st, 2009. And you know, go back to January 1st, 2009, we were worried that the ATM machines in this country were going to stop working. I mean, we had no idea what was going to happen to the financial system. We're an organization based 100% on voluntary philanthropy. Now, that was a bad time. to be relying on voluntary philanthropy. And we were badly underwater on my first day on the job, and I didn't know what to do. Now, I'd taught business at the university for a long time, and I thought about this principle. What do? You cut everybody 100%? You cut everybody a little? What do you do? And so we took the shot, and I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I'm not just such a wonderful humanitarian. I thought, well, what'll happen if we cut everybody a little, and we cut the management team double as much? Okay, and I went home on my first day on the job, and I told my wife, Esther, honey, I just cut my salary more than anybody else in the company. And she said, you're a great businessman. and I mean, and I got to tell you, it inflected the morale in our company. It was accidental on my part. It bears out Simon's principle. We actually were able to improve our fundraising more than we ever had before. And by October of 2009, we had restored everybody's pay and back paid everything we chipped out of their salaries in the very beginning of the year. And in the following year, we grew 26%. I don't know if it was because of that, but let me tell you, the team didn't suffer. And there was no narrative of going around Washington, D.C. that people were jumping the ship during this really, really hard time. So I'm here to tell you, I'm not such a great guy. I just happened across this, and this is very practical. This actually works.
But it begs the question, because the science is on our side. I mean, there's biology on our side, which is there's human beings are social animals, and we respond to the environments we're in. You take a good person, you put them in a bad environment, they do bad things. You take somebody who maybe has performed bad acts, maybe is considered untrustworthy, you put them in a good environment, they'll turn their lives around and become remarkable, trustworthy members of society. We're social animals, we respond to the environments we're in. Leaders are supposed to produce the environments that produce, you get the environment right, you get trust and cooperation. You get the environment wrong, you get cynicism, paranoia, mistrust, and self-interest. It's just a biological reaction. So if we have the science on our side, we have case studies on our side, it begs the question, why doesn't everybody do it? And what I've come to learn is because these strategies that you guys employed, it is hard to predict the time in which you will see the benefit from those decisions. And companies don't like that. Companies like to know that on this day, we can measure that the number will be what we want it to be, right? They prefer consistency over, they prefer intensity over consistency. And if you consider you can't go to the gym for 9 hours and get into shape, but if you work out every single day for 20 minutes, you absolutely will get into shape 100%. The problem is I don't know when. I just know it will work, right? It's like brushing your teeth. And businesses prefer intensity because they want to demonstrate X savings on X day and have that very easily measured. The strategies that you guys employed, we don't know when you'll see the fruits. We just know it'll work. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of organizations.
Now, something that's on a lot of people's minds here is we started by talking about business leadership. And a lot of people in here are business leaders, to be sure. Highly practical suggestion that we have that's also consistent with the way that we want our hearts to work. One of the principles that we have in my organization is that morals have to come before markets. And I think that's manifestly true in any system in the world. And the more you rely on markets, by the way, the more you have to think about your morals first. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But let's go to what is on a lot of people's minds here as well, which is to move from the business to the political. Apply some of these ideas to what we're actually seeing politically today. Not necessarily being really personal about what we're doing, but what's going wrong politically, and how can we constructively change that on the basis of trust, on the basis of leadership that's aspirational and that's uniting instead of dividing?
What we see in politics is it's a clear mirror of what's happening in business. They're one and the same, where short term has been prioritized over long term, where what's in it for the organization has been prioritized over what's in it for the community. And whereas an organization, in public companies, for example, meeting some arbitrary projection on some arbitrary date and meeting some analysts' projection. I'll tell you a quick funny story aside. Gary Ridge, who's the CEO of WD-40, great company, his analyst called him up on the analyst call, chastised him and said, you missed your numbers. And Gary said, no, I missed your numbers, mine are fine. But what we see in politics is people prioritizing their re-election over doing something great. I had a conversation with a member of Congress, I will leave their name out of it, and in a moment of, it was a very uncomfortable conversation, uncomfortable for them, not for me, where I basically said, I know human beings, I know people in uniform who would risk their lives and have risked their lives to do the right thing. I said, you won't even sacrifice your job to do the right thing. And I said, here's the joke. If you lost your election, you'll get picked up by some lobbying group or some law firm anyway, and you will make triple the money you're making now. So what exactly are you losing? Like, where is the sacrifice exactly? And she actually agreed. She said that we absolutely do prioritize getting reelected over some of the decisions we have to make, and then has this ridiculous rationalization that because if I don't win my reelection, I can't do good, which is a backwards logic. You do good, and if you do good, hopefully you'll win your reelection sometimes, and you can still do good even if you don't get reelected. Like they're not mutually exclusive. And I think this started. I think one of the problems is that it's become a competitive environment, politics, and it's no longer a cooperative environment. And I think we can trace it back to Newt Gingrich's contract with America, where he was the first one to tell members, because remember, when you got elected to national office, what you would do is you'd move your family to Washington, and you would fight on the floor during the day, but then you'd all go to PTA meetings together at night and sit in the bleachers and watch your kids play ball together, and you knew each other as human beings, and you saw each other as human beings. Now they come to Washington by themselves, they work for 2.5 days, then they go back to home, they don't move their families, and they don't actually know each other. Sometimes even within their own party. They literally have no human and social interactions, so they only see each other as competitors, not as people. I think this is a very destructive way to run any organization. We all know this, that it's difficult to develop relationships at a distance. We all know that it's much easier to resolve conflict when we're in a room together fighting with somebody as opposed to typing it or sending mean emails to each other.
Or tweeting.
Or tweeting at each other, yeah.
Not that that's salient in
no,
American
yeah.
culture today.
Hypothetically speaking.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think national politicians should move their families to Washington again and try and get to know each other as humans again. I think we've completely lost the humanity in politics.
I want to underline something that Simon said just a minute ago, because I think it's really important for us to understand. That's central to the way that he thinks, and it's hugely useful for all of us. He does a lot of work with the military, he does a lot of work with business, he does a lot of work with politicians. And what he has asked, in a nutshell, is this. When he talks to people in the military, he realizes that they have answered the question, I know what I'm willing to die for. We don't have to confront that in modern life very much. Yet we should be able to have the answer to that question, and at very least have the answer to the question as leaders, what am I willing to fail for? What am I willing to be fired for? What am I willing to be humiliated for? Great leaders can answer that question. And if the answer is nothing, there's a problem. That's what he's saying in a nutshell here. And that's just the big thing that each of us can take away. What am I willing to be humiliated for? Where is it a good value to me, where the benefits are higher than the costs? And be able to sort that one out. Sort that one out on the way to aspirational leadership.
And I think you're touching on what leadership is. You know, leadership has nothing to do with rank. Leadership is a responsibility. It's not about being in charge, it's about taking care of those in your charge. And I know many people who sit at the highest levels of organizations, we all do, who are not leaders. They have authority, and we do as they tell us because they have authority over us, but we would not follow them. And we all know people who are very junior in organizations who have no authority, but they've made the choice to look after the person to the left of them, and they've made the choice to look after the person to the right of them, and that's why we call them leaders. Leaders are not necessarily the ones in charge, they're the ones with the courage to go first towards the unknown, first towards the danger, first to be humiliated because it's the right thing. And the amazing thing is the reason we call them leaders is because when they do that, others follow. And it really is a courage thing. So then it begs the question, where does courage come from? Spending time with folks in the military who, what I've learned is courage is not some deep internal fortitude. Like you don't dig down deep and find the courage. It actually is an external thing. So when I got to meet people who'd risked their lives, I asked them, why did you do it? You have a family, you have kids, no one would have faulted you if you didn't do it, no one would have ordered you to do what you did, why did you do it? They all give the same answer, because they would have done it for me. In other words, when we have the belief that someone has our backs, when we have the absolute certainty that someone cares about us and is there by our side and believes in us, we actually are able to do extraordinary things. But without those relationships, it's very hard to muster courage. Some world-famous trapeze artist is not going to try a brand new death-defying act for the first time without a net. It's the net. It's that external thing that gives us the courage to do difficult things. In other words, it goes back to human relationships again. And so when we foster those relationships, when we foster the love in the community, we actually have the courage to do what you're saying we need to do. But when we don't, when politicians and businessmen, when we all feel lonely in positions of rank, I think that actually hurts the ability to lead.
There, I saw a very interesting, I've been doing research on the subject of courage. Why? Because I'm very interested in the subject of fear. When we talk about not knowing what you're willing to be humiliated and fail over, it means that you have a fear-based model. And fear is directly related to pride, and it's bound up in courage. And trying to net this out, I found a very interesting body of work by a psychologist at the University of British Columbia who's done work on fear. You know this work, where he's talked to bomb squad members of the British police force in Northern Ireland, those who did a lot of work in the 70s and early 80s, and then fighter pilots who'd been in combat. And here's the very interesting thing that he found. Courage is not the absence of fear. He found that about 26% of people in really dangerous jobs don't feel fear. They're fearless. They're the worst leaders. The ones who really are great leaders feel the fear and act anyway. Courage is a response to fear, and you can't, literally, you can't actually exhibit courage unless you feel fear. Fear is incredibly important for your virtue, is the way that this turns out. So fear is not the enemy. The idea, the title of fearless leader is an insult. Courageous leader. That's actually something that we should all be aspiring to. And I found from that literature, and it reminds me of the stuff that you've talked about. It enriches our understanding of how fear works in the first place.
And it goes back to your work and what I love about your work when you talk about morals and morality in leadership. And I think, and it goes back to Milton Friedman. You know, we have the standard definition that we sort of embrace is the definition of business and the responsibility of companies is a Milton Friedman definition. And he said, where's the effect of, you know, the purpose of business is to maximize profits within the bounds of the law, which I think is a completely wrong definition. It's a very, you know, morality and ethics are a higher standard than the law. And we hear it all the time when organizations do things that we know are wrong, they make us uncomfortable and we question them. They all say the same thing, we broke no laws. I mean, here's the analogy, right? Which is, so the Titanic, the builders of the Titanic, when they built that ship, the laws and regulations that governed lifeboats back then were built for the biggest ships that existed in the time, which were ferries. And the Titanic was 4 times bigger than the biggest ferry. So there was no lifeboats for all regulation. It didn't exist. It was based on numbers. So the makers of the Titanic, because it was too expensive to put all lifeboats for all, actually put the maximum number of lifeboats as required by regulation on the Titanic, which was a quarter of what the size of the boat actually was, right? But they actually left berths for future lifeboats, knowing that eventually the regulations would catch up, right? So the Titanic hits an iceberg. We all know the story. Do you know how many people died on the Titanic versus how many were saved? 25% of the people who were aboard the Titanic were saved. 25%. 3/4 died. In other words, about the number of lifeboats they didn't have. They broke no laws. But clearly, morality says, shouldn't you have a lifeboat for everyone? Even though they broke no laws. Now that's the analogy for the way I think too much of business is conducted, which is it's conducted with the bounds of the law, where everybody knows that there's a morality that they're missing, and they know that eventually the regulations will catch up, but I don't understand why people don't act morally despite the law.
Yes, indeed.
This is your frame. This is your.
You know, I want to. Speaking of this, I actually do want to pivot a little bit to a slightly different area that you've written about, that we've both thought about. And what I want to do is I want to tell you a study that I just read that blew my mind, and then I want you to react to it. Okay? I read a study. I read about 15 social psych and behavioral science studies every morning, which is not normal. But I read a study about empathy. About empathy and leadership and empathy. And it was looking at the most effective leaders with respect to to how they manage their workforces and the bottom line of their companies, but not just the public valuation of these companies, really a robust understanding of effective leaders. And what it found was the most effective leaders over the course of their leadership career, the cadence of their leadership career, there's some really interesting stuff. For example, they tend to be the most effective between the ages of 55 and 70. That's the zone of effective leadership, particularly for business leaders, because high energy, high wisdom haven't said screw it yet. Okay, that's one of the interesting findings from this. But here's what I'm getting at. The study also found that as they went through the cadence of their careers and got more and more and more effective, their empathy went down. They had lower empathy at the end of their careers than at the beginning, and it was monotonically decreasing over the course of their careers. What does Simon Sinek say?
What's monotonically mean?
That means continuously.
Oh, okay.
It's like, I got that from Shakespeare.
I'm surprised by that, to be honest. The whole idea that they're better at the end makes more sense because you know, if you want candid advice, you ask an old person because they don't care what you think about them. And happiness studies show that as well. People are at their happiest when they're young because they're oblivious, and they're happiest when they're old.
He didn't say clueless. He said oblivious.
And they're happiest when they're old because they've faced their own mortality and they're at peace. And like they don't care what you think about them anymore. And people actually at their least happiest in middle age, where you're most concerned what everybody thinks about you and if you're successful and if you're good looking and if you're doing well and all of that stuff. And so the idea that empathy would actually go down later, the only thing that I could react to that is, have they just become jaded? I'm surprised by it, to be honest. And maybe it goes to that thing that they don't care what you think about them anymore. I don't.
So let me give you a second piece of the puzzle now, because now I think that and this is what opened my eyes to it.
I want to know more details about who they were.
You're right. I mean, that of course.
There's a missing detail there.
For sure, among others. They got less empathetic, but they got more compassionate. That's the interesting part. Empathy and compassion are not the same thing. Linking to somebody emotionally is not the same thing as being dedicated to doing the right thing for people even when it's hard.
I think that I agree with, because they don't have to be all wrapped up in the emotion of the people that they're serving, but they have a deep-seated belief that the right thing to do is to take care of the people because it's the right thing to do. So perhaps being empathetically disconnected actually makes it easier to be compassionate, because it becomes intellectualized, as opposed to, because we can make stupid decisions based on empathy because there's too much feeling, where you can actually say the right thing. I think it's the moral compass. I think it sounds like the moral compass grows, even though I'm not personally invested emotionally in the decisions of what's happening. I just know it's the right thing to do.
It seems to me that this is a key point that you make in Leaders Get Last, isn't it? It's
I like that.
Leaders, particularly military leaders that you talk about, are not empathetic with their charges, but they're highly compassionate with their charges in the robust sense of this, right?
I think that's very interesting.
So I asked, I was thinking about an example of this principle that I could really use. And I have this strange friendship and an ongoing working relationship with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is the most unexpected thing, because he hangs out at this think tank, the American Enterprise Institute.
He knows where you work, right?
He knows where I work. He does know where I work. It's the weirdest thing of all, right? I mean, you'd think that, and what you notice when you're dealing a lot closely with the Dalai Lama, that there's not a strong sense of him linking to you with your personal experiences. On the contrary, you say goodbye and it's remorseless. And you say hello and it's like he just saw you, or maybe never saw you before. But he's highly compassionate. Really compassionate person. And it seemed to me, and one time when I was leaving him, after I'd been with him for several days, and he said to me, he said, I see you, and I always want to give you something, but I don't own anything. And he said, but I want to find something. So he looked into his little purple, or his little maroon and orange purse, and he pulled out a pen. He had a pen, and he said, I've had this ballpoint pen. Somebody gave it to me 15 years ago. It was kind of a nice pen, like one of those $15 pens. And he said, I want you to have this. I want you to have this. And it was like he was giving me the Holy Grail or something. The Dalai Lama giving me a pen. I was like, wow. And I put it in my and I put it in my briefcase, and I carried it around for a year. And I looked at it and it gave me a warm feeling. And then I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's the auxiliary Roman Catholic bishop for Los Angeles, Bishop Robert Barron, a really good friend of mine. And we were talking and we were eating in a sandwich place and he was writing on a napkin. Or he had pulled out a napkin. I said something, he wanted to write it down. He said, "Do you have a pen?" And I said, I do. I do. And then I said to him, and this was, I'm kind of embarrassed about this because this was prideful and it was sort of self-centered. And I said, "The Dalai Lama gave me that pen," right? And he said, "Oh, I've always loved the Dalai Lama. I admire him so much. I've always wanted to meet him." And he talked about how his work had affected him so very, very much. And at that moment, the Dalai Lama in his compassion came to me. And you know what he said to me? He wasn't there, and I'm not insane. But I don't think. You know what he said to me? He said, "You know what you need to do." And I gave Bishop Barron that pen. Because the gift of that pen was in the giving of that pen. And I had no idea. That had never occurred to me in the past. I mean, certainly I've learned that. I learned that in Sunday school or something when I was a kid. But the Dalai Lama taught me that, not with empathy. He taught me that with a deep act of compassion. And it changed my life a tiny little bit in that moment.
You know, now that we're talking about it, I wonder if you need to have empathy in middle management. I wonder if you need to have empathy when you're actually physically more connected with your team. And then later, as you gain seniority, that's where compassion is, because the people you're physically connected with is going to be a senior group of people. You're not going to be connected with, the rank and file. So you can't actually have empathy with people that you have no relationship with. So you actually need compassion. I wonder if that's the thing. Because, in a company-sized group of soldiers, Marines, whatever, it's about 200 people. And even if you get smaller than that, you talk to folks in the military and they'll say that they can judge when a young lieutenant is a good lieutenant because of the way that the troops refer to him or her. They'll say, "That's our lieutenant," as opposed to the lieutenant. It's always the colonel, because it's too far. It's always the colonel. But that's our lieutenant. And when the troops make the transition from the lieutenant to our lieutenant, that means there's a relationship. And I think at that level, you need to have empathy. You need to know your troops. You need to know their names. You need to know their faces. You need to know their families. I think in business, you need to know your people. You need to know the names of their kids. You need to know where they live, what goes on in their lives. But as you become disconnected physically, I think that's where compassion, that makes perfect sense.
Can we write about this?
Yeah,
Let's
we should.
Write about this.
This is
Let's
good.
write about this.
This, by the way, is unrehearsed. This is
totally. Yeah. I've got 2 quick questions left, and then I want to go to you.
Very good.
So we've got at least 20 minutes so start getting your thoughts, and we'll talk about the ground rules on how that stuff works just here in a second. But first, I want to ask a question before I get to your new creative product, which I'm really fascinated with. But I have one more question, and it's about happiness. I've written about happiness. You've written about happiness. Tell me how important it is for you and me and everybody in this audience to be happy leaders.
I don't like the term happiness. I like the term fulfillment. I like the term joy. Happiness to me is something that is fleeting. And you can have happiness because you win the piece of business, or you hit your numbers, or you go see a movie, and happiness is wonderful and it's great, and then it goes away. It doesn't last. Where deep fulfillment, like love,
meaning,
purpose, all of that kind of stuff.
Or you could say the why.
The why, yeah.
As it were.
But deep fulfillment, I think, is a much higher standard. Let me equate it to, like, you don't like your kids every day, but you love your kids every day. It's that kind of thing.
This is true.
Yeah.
This is true.
And so...
Deep truth, friend.
You don't have to be happy every day, but you can be fulfilled every day. You don't have to like your job every day, but you can love your job every day. And I think that people confuse the two. And people are seeking happiness in their work, and they're doing it through all the ways you would think they would do it in short-term things. So, like, and you see it the way we lead young people too, which is we put in free food and bean bags and all these fun things at the office because we want to make our employees happy, and it absolutely works. It just doesn't make them fulfilled, and they still are unhappy and they still quit, or they still are unfulfilled and they still quit. And I think this is the problem. I think we've confused the terms because they're not the same. So I'm more interested in people finding deep fulfillment in their work, and I'm sure they will find happiness throughout that also.
This is interesting because, of course, you're defining the Aristotelian understanding of deep happiness, which is a good life well lived based on a sense of meaning and purpose. And yet we've fallen into a definition of psychological happiness in society where we're searching for something that is inherently ephemeral. And what we want to find is something consistent with our deepest views. And now, Jung...
There's an irony in that too, which is the idea of searching for happiness.
Right.
Right? It's not a scavenger hunt. You don't be like, look under a rock and be like, I found happiness. I found the job I love. You know, it's like, you don't find love either. Like, you find somebody who cares about you, that you care about, you fall in love. I'm not sure exactly what day it happened, and then you work tirelessly every day to stay in love. Because if you stop working, the love goes away. And it's the same at work. You don't find a job you love. You find a place where you share the values, you fit, they care about you as a human being, you fall in love with your job, and you work tirelessly every day to take care of the people around you, and you remain fulfilled. So I think the whole concept of searching for happiness, or searching for the job that you love, or searching for love is completely misguided. It's finding an area where you could work hard at it, and then you have to work hard to keep it. And the worst part is so do they. And if one of you quits, then the thing goes haywire. And that goes for employees and for management, which is they have to work hard, but at this, and so do we. So I think our language is not helping us.
Before we
Jung, you were going to talk about Jung.
I was going to talk about Jung. Jung talked about the important that somebody can't be truly happy and fulfilled in their life until their day-to-day existence and work is consistent with their own deepest values. The hardest thing to do is not to find the right job. The hardest thing to do is to figure out what you believe. The weirdest thing is that most people actually don't know what they think. Most people don't know what they want. Most people don't know what their deepest values are. And this gets back to your point a little bit earlier. What are you willing to fail for? If you want to figure out what you believe, figure out what you'd be willing to be completely humiliated and fired over. And if you know the answer to that, then you're on track to find Simon's understanding of deep fulfillment as the superior substitute for psychological happiness.
As long as there's a group of people around you who care about you and have your back, you can find the courage to fail or be humiliated. I don't think we can do it by ourselves, or few are the people who can do it, and I wouldn't trust them.
Yeah. Before we turn to our friends to grill you a little bit more, tell me about your new book. What's on your mind? What's keeping you up at night?
Oh, yeah. No, it's wonderful. I've become obsessed with game theory. It's fascinating stuff. So whenever there's at least two competitors in a system, you have a game, and the rules of game theory apply. And if you know the rules of the game, you can do well. If you don't know the rules of the game, you're not going to do well. The vast majority of organizations who are in a contest actually do not understand the rules of their game, which means most organizations are heading towards zero, which I am fascinated by. So here's the quick of it. There are two types of games. There are finite games and there are infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed-upon objective. Baseball. We know the rules. We all agree whoever has more runs at the end of 9 innings is the winner, and we all go home. When you have an infinite game, infinite games are defined as known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, and the objective is to perpetuate the game, to keep the game in play. When you put a finite player versus a finite player, the system is stable. Baseball is stable. When you put an infinite player versus an infinite player, the system is also stable, like the Cold War, because you cannot have a winner or a loser in the Cold War, right? So you keep the game in play. And what happens in infinite contests is players drop out of the game when they run out of the will or the resources to play. But the game perpetuates with or without them, right? So the game of business is an infinite game. The game of business has pre-existed every single company on the planet. It will outlast every single company on the planet. There's no such thing as winning the game of business. It doesn't exist. And when one player goes bankrupt or is merger acquired, they drop out of the game, and another competitor will replace them. A new company will emerge. A new technology will emerge. But if you listen to the language of business, we very quickly see that most businesses actually don't know the game they're in. They talk about being number one, beating their competition, being the best, based on what agreed upon objectives, based on what agreed upon time frame. So that means when you're playing by finite rules in infinite contests, you will quickly go to zero. So here's a real life example. I spoke at an education summit for Microsoft. I also spoke at an education summit for Apple. At the Microsoft summit, the vast majority of the executives spent most of their PowerPoint presentations talking about how to beat Apple. At the Apple summit, the 100% of the executives spend 100% of their presentations talking about how to help teachers teach and how to help students learn. One was obsessed with where they were going. The other one was obsessed with beating their competition. Guess which one is in quagmire, right? So at the end of my talk at Microsoft, they gave me a new Zune when it was a thing. That was their competitor to the iPod. And this thing was spectacular. It was the most gorgeous piece of technology I've ever used. The user interface was beautiful. It was simple. It was user-friendly. It was really fantastic. But of course, nobody ever bought one because it's a different story. So when I was done working at Apple, I was sharing a taxi with a senior Apple executive. Did I ever tell you this? I was sharing a taxi with a senior Apple executive, sort of employee number 12 kind of guy. So I decided to stir the pot. It's a bad habit. And I turn to him and I say, you know, I was at Microsoft and they gave me the new Zune, and it is so much better than your iPod Touch. And he turned to me and he said, I have no doubt. Conversation over. Because an infinite player understands sometimes you're ahead and sometimes you're behind. Sometimes they have a better product, sometimes you have a better product. The objective is not to win every battle, the objective is to outlast them. And so one organization is making strategic decisions for a short-term gain of beating their competition based on some arbitrary number and arbitrary time frame that they picked, whereas the other organization is being built for resilience. And I love that. There's over 80% of the Dow Index are companies 35 years or younger. Where are all the old companies?
Gone.
Where are they? And even some of the old ones aren't really old. They've been merged and acquired so many times. They're not really the companies that were.
Well, one thing that I want to point out, based on Simon's
that's
work, that relates to the earlier comments that he was making, the original comments that we made about the leadership crisis in the United States, is that the competition and cooperation are typically thought of as antagonistic to each other. The biggest mistake that we make when we talk about business, or we talk about politics, or we talk about family life or community life, is to say that you either have to be all about competition or all about cooperation. If you're all about one and you don't have a balance with the other, you will lose. You will lose and you will be ineffective. The truth of the matter is that the New York Yankees are both competitive and cooperative with the Boston Red Sox. Nobody in the Yankees organization, except for the most rabid fans, thinks you should be blowing up the Red Sox bus on the way to the game.
The best infinite players, this is right to your point, the best infinite players, they love having a worthy adversary. So Montgomery kept a portrait of Rommel in his quarters. They had deep respect for each other, and they loved the idea of competing against each other intellectually and besting each other. But they considered each other worthy adversaries. And so I think it's very important for teams or companies to view their competition as worthy adversaries rather than someone to beat.
And remember that there are rules, and there are rules of cooperation that actually make business work better, and we should be respectful of them. On the contrary, we should actually celebrate those.
When Apple was going bankrupt, it was Microsoft that bailed them out.
We have 15 minutes and 1 second left for you. And here's kind of how it works. We have our friends who have microphones, and you're going to put your hand up, and I'm going to call on you, and the mic's going to come to you. If you would stand up and tell me, you're going to be first, because I saw your hand first, and you're going to tell us your name and where you're from and what's on your mind. Mic's coming to you right now.
Am I doing this right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Giselle. I'm from North Carolina, and thanks first of all for an amazing conversation about leadership and inspiration. My question is, or what I'd ask you to try to close the loop on, it's fascinating, the concept of game theory, and I wondered if you could tie that back to the very first set of comments around people versus, focus on people within business, et cetera. And if it's relevant, if you can sort of talk about social innovation and the opportunities there, because you've mostly sort of focused on corporate enterprise versus social enterprise.
Yeah. So in order to play the infinite game, you have to have teamwork and you have to take care of your people. Because if you only, if the entire organization is built on a sort of hit the goal, get the bonus, hit the goal, get the bonus, hit the goal, get the bonus, you can actually create an organization where people be competitive against each other, not with each other, and in time it'll destroy the internal culture. So building strong teams and prioritizing people is the only way to play the infinite game, because it also builds into it resilience beyond the personality of the person at the top. Because very often you'll see some wonderful, wonderful organizations with this wonderful inspired leader, but they cannot survive the loss of their inspired leaders. We saw it happen at Walmart. Sam Walton was great, and then he left. And then Mike Duke eventually came in. You're like, you have to be kidding me, you know? Total opposite kind of leader. And we see that all too often. And so you can only play the infinite game if people see that their responsibility is to take the torch and carry it forwards, not to sort of be in the best job. You know, nobody's vying politically for the #1 job kind of thing. So it's essential for the infinite game. And in terms of the social world, I rail the fact that we distinguish the two as separate. It drives me nuts. I hate the fact that we call not-profits nonprofits. That's a tax delineation. No one wants to be defined by what they aren't. It also makes money a dirty thing, not profit. You need money to sustain. Money is fuel. You can have a beautiful car, no fuel, don't go. And then and charity is a terrible word as well, as if we're doing something for free, right? I think they should call themselves for-impact organizations, right? I work for a for-impact organization, and by the way, you better be profitable, but you define profit differently. If your objective is to rescue kittens from trees, then you better be rescuing more kittens from trees this month than you were last month. That is profit. So the money is the fuel, and the profit is defined by whatever your cause is, and you're in the for-impact space. But the rules are all the same for both organizations.
Right here in the back, and then we're going to come over to right in the middle right here.
Good morning. Great talk. My name is Alex Rosenfeld from Climate Impact Capital based in Houston. I'd love to get your thoughts as an optimist as how you could apply or how we could all apply game theory to the issues of climate change. Certainly, it's a very interesting game where people can opt out and be free riders on others, but we all need to work together to make an impact. So love to hear your thoughts on how we can game the game to make it work for all of us.
Yeah. So I was at the Southern Company thing this morning where we were talking about just that, and there was some language that I realized Arthur and I have been saying that some of the language sort of hijacks us, unfortunately, and I think the language of sustainability is the wrong language, because sustainability is it sounds like a liberal philosophy, and I think the word that we should be using is resilience. I think, is our planet resilient? Are we helping the planet be resilient? Are our organizations resilient? Because if we're relying on limited fossil fuels, that's not resilient. And so I think we've done I think the climate scientists have done a bad job marketing. I think it's a problem in marketing because it was very rational, and it was very paternalistic, and it was never really stated as a cause that we could all join in on. It was sort of a political philosophy. So I think language is one of the big challenges there. And the things I'm learning is I think resilience. Are we building a resilient planet?
Our friend from Houston made one assertion that I think is important. Just I want to draw you out on one quick point. Are you an optimist?
Yeah.
Because it occurs to me when I'm listening to you, I mean, optimism suggests that there is a set path, that the future is kind of out there already, and we believe that the future will be better than the present. I take you as more of a hopeful person, as somebody who believes that the future can be in our hands if we do the right thing. I don't know the outcome. Simon doesn't know the outcome, but Simon believes that each of us can be the agent of positive change, and as such, I mean, that hope is a great theological virtue, not optimism. I take you as kind of a prophet of hope more than a prophet of optimism.
Okay.
Like, I thought that was beautiful, and he just like really. I mean, it's like, all right, next question, fine. It's like we're right here, and we got the mic coming to you, ma'am. Well, we got a mic coming to you, ma'am.
Tell them who you are.
Oh, sorry. Nina McLemore, and I'm in the apparel business. The question is about how do you build the team? And what do you do when you have team players who are either not competent or not passionate about the game or defensive?
Okay, sure. So competence absolutely matters, of course. You hired them. So what did you see in them that you hired? Did they lie to you? And the question is it that they're incompetent, or is it that they're in the wrong place inside the organization? Are they incompetent? Do they have a lack of training? So is there a mechanism for somebody to say to you, so an organization that is well led you can have vulnerability. There's a circle of safety, there's vulnerability in that organization. Vulnerability doesn't mean we will walk around crying. Vulnerability means someone can walk into your office and say, I don't think I'm prepared to do this job that you've asked me to do. I don't feel qualified to do it. Or they can come to you and say, I made a mistake. Or they come to you and say, I'm scared. Or I'm having troubles at home. In other words, we don't know what's producing the failure or the struggle in the performance. It could be any host of things that may or may not be their competence. So the question is, do you have a mechanism to have that conversation? You talked about people who aren't passionate. Everyone's passionate, we're just not all passionate for the same things. Passion is a result, it's like profit, which is if I'm engaged in something that feeds my soul and I feel safe in the environment I'm in and I feel like I'm growing, I will be passionate. And so if you say that people are unpassionate inside the organization, I wouldn't blame the people. I'd say either they're in the wrong job, or you shouldn't have hired them because they don't actually fit your value set, or there's something going on in their life that maybe we should be concerned about them. Like, are you okay? Your passion is down. This is not like you. And what was the third point? Defensive. And defensive. So if people are defensive, again, is there a culture of feedback? Do you have a culture where honest feedback is expected and required, which doesn't happen overnight? Are they put in environments where they can feel safe being criticized as opposed to feeling that they need to be defensive? Again, I don't blame the people. Do you have a communications training course? Do you teach effective confrontation? Because maybe the person being defensive, it's the person who's confronting them who doesn't know how to have a confrontation. And if you attack me that way, I'd be defensive too. So it's not always the people. We're so quick to say they're incompetent, they're not passionate, and they're defensive, and yet we don't look at ourselves and say, maybe I don't know how to have a confrontation, maybe I'm not being empathetic enough, and maybe we shouldn't have hired them or we put them in the wrong position. And then if we made a bad hire, we can't blame them for that. So how do we help? Because if we're not happy with them, they're not happy working, how do we help them find a new job with dignity?
Fantastic. We're going to go to the back on the right, and then we'll come up right here. Okay, right here in the back.
Hello, my name is Fernando. I have a startup based in Mexico City.
I give you this.
And I wanted to ask what your thoughts were regarding that. More often than not, we find ourselves surrounded by negative environments. And you spoke about this analogy of the acrobat not doing a stunt without a safety net, which would be people caring for you. But what about if that doesn't happen? I think really the point is trying to make negative environments into good environments.
Yeah.
And maybe trying to go further than that step of empathy and compassion towards doing something that you know that other people will not do for you,
yeah.
but you do it for them instead of waiting for them to do it for you.
Yeah, if you're truly in a toxic environment, one option is always to leave that environment, right? If it's a job, right? But that's not necessarily the only option. And this is sort of similar question that I get often, which is what happens if you're in middle management and senior management doesn't get any of this stuff and they only care about numbers before people, not people before numbers. The answer is you ignore them because you can't influence or control that which you cannot control, and you take responsibility for the things you can control, in other words, yourself. And you become the leader you wish you had. You become a student of leadership, and you obsess about making sure that the people with whom you work, the people whose names you know and faces you recognize, that they are able to go home every day and say to their loved ones, I love my job because of what you're doing for them. In other words, you commit yourself to the life of service. You commit yourself to the practice of leadership and taking care of the people over whom you can influence. They could be above you, below you, to the left or the right of you, but this very small enclave. And what starts to happen is these little subcultures start to emerge of incredible joy and happiness within more toxic environments because they're all taking care of each other. And what happens is one of those people gets moved and goes somewhere else. They take those lessons. They start to do the same thing. It starts to grow. The performance of those groups tends to be better than others. And if you get a critical mass, the tail wags the dog. The internal can actually change the direction of the entire organization. It takes time, though.
I think the short version of that is model the behavior that you want to see. And that is so true for each one of us all over in our lives. You know, how many people are complaining about about the bitterness and the anger and the hostility in politics today, to what extent are we modeling the behavior that we want to see?
So
if
true.
you wished people treated each other with greater warm-heartedness in the face of overwhelming political contempt, how have you treated somebody with whom you disagree with warm-heartedness instead of with contempt? And each one of us can actually change the world a tiny little bit in the next 24 hours by doing exactly that. We're going to have an opportunity to do that. This is how we do it at work, but each one of us can model the behavior that we want to see in our ordinary lives. That's moral agency. My friends, that's power.
Amen.
All right, we're going to come right up to the right. Yes, ma'am. I can't remember. I had promised we'd come up to this region here, so.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Komal. I'm from San Francisco, California. And thank you for this great talk, and I've made every employee of mine watch both of your TED Talks several times, so thank you. So my question is, if a company has two whys, so for instance, mine does, we recover high quality surplus food from businesses and events that would otherwise throw it away, and then redistribute that food to nonprofits that are in need. So essentially technology to solve both hunger and food waste. So my why is much more fueled through the eradicating of world hunger, which we believe we could do, whereas other people on my team are much more fueled about reducing food waste. Can those two whys be equally weighed in a company? And can that why, if one of the whys is more of the profit-making engine of the company, be more visible in some avenues and less in others?
Yeah. So you don't have more than one why. A why is the purpose, cause, or belief upon which the organization exists that exists on a level higher than the thing that you do. So what you explained to me was what the company does, or you explained a strategic road to get to something else, right? So there is a purpose or cause that drives you. Are you the founder? Yeah. So there's a purpose or cause that drives you, that you saw this as an effective means to advance whatever cause or belief that you believe in. And you saw that feeding people is a good strategy, is a good means to advance something that's even bigger than that. And if you didn't do this, you'd do something else. So you only have one why, and I would argue that you haven't yet articulated yet. And the reason that so you're having issues inside the organization where some people believe in this one, but some people believe in that one. That means you're not at the why. The why level says we all believe in this, we all work different ways to do it. So our organization, our why is to inspire people to do the things that inspire them. I haven't told you a single thing about what we do yet. And we have a vision that if everything we do comes to life, we can imagine a world in which the vast majority of people will wake up every single morning inspired to go to work, feel safe when they're there, and return home fulfilled at the end of the day. Now, what do we do? Well, inside the organization, there's all kinds of stuff. And we all are passionate about different ways to advance that. So I'm the dancing monkey who speaks and writes about it, right? And then there are folks inside our organization who want nothing to do with what I do. They would never want to do this, but they found ways to do it through taking care of the customer, like literally having the face-to-face. They love that. And they see that that is the best means to advance our cause, which is to have that face-to-face advice, right? But we all believe in the same cause. And so I would argue that you haven't actually articulated your why yet, because there's only one.
My friends, we are coming to the end of our session, and I want to take simply the last 20 seconds to sum up the 4 big things that we've learned and heard from Simon Sinek today. Principle number 1. Leaders who know their own why understand shared sacrifice, which is a privilege, not a negative. Principle number 2, ask yourself, what am I willing to fail for? If you can answer that, you're on track to understanding your why. Principle number 3 is that courage is the ability to act in the face of fear, but to do that, we need people we trust. Find those people you trust and be those people that other people can trust. And principle number 4 is that purpose matters more than happiness. So set upon your own purpose and help other people find theirs. Good words, good thoughts, words for a better world from Simon Sinek. Thank you.
Arthur Brooks.